Europe.
Yeah, yesterday I was in Vienna, the day before in Regensburg, and it's been one lecture per day, actually. This is the last. Tomorrow morning I'll go back to France, but actually not home. My wife's going to pick me up in the north, where we actually have become owners of a castle, and we're going to learn some of the technical aspects now of how to operate this thing. It's it's for hosting colloquia, poetry readings, that sort of thing. This is our project now.
Okay, well, our people need to be in touch with your
That's
people.
right, yeah, it's that kind of thing. This would be a good sort of group, I think, to bring it, yeah.
Okay, that's the future. I promised that I would share each day a little bit of gladdening light with you, and it's very interesting if you look at Dr. Franke's trajectory. He's written some books about apophatic theology, and I'm going to explain a little bit, and he's going to correct me, so I'm just going to go on record, but...
That's the very nature of apophatic. It's all correction, actually. There's no right way to say it. It can only be corrected. So please, start the process, yeah.
I'll live with that. So he wrote something, 15, 20 years ago about theology without words, beyond logos. And my understanding of apophatic theology is the absence of imagery. That's what I've been taught, and so I think of it as kind of the Buddhist way, that you're absolutely divorcing any relational aspects with words or with images in order to experience God. So cataphatic theology, of which Gladdening Light is a big proponent, is full of imagery, and you might say, I've been told that certain hymns represent apophatic theology because there's a rhythm there that takes you out of the words and into pure song, whereas motets or classical music, symphonies, that's cataphatic because it's so full of things, and iconography is cataphatic. So if you are prone to want to pray in front of an icon or use that as a means to experience God, that's more the cataphatic approach. So yes. Okay. All right, this is Dr. Franke here.
Right. Good. And actually, the only thing that I want to correct in what was just said is that apophatic and cataphatic are inseparable, right? You can't really do the one without the other. That certainly goes for apophatic. There's nothing to say at all. It's only by negating a cataphatic discourse, which gives positive images about God, that you can open up this apophatic dimension, which doesn't have any content of its own. It's only a content that is in the process of being erased.
So they're connected.
Absolutely. From the very beginning, this is Dionysius the Areopagite, right? The turn from the 4th to the 5th century, who is, we say, the father of apophatic theology. You can go back much further, of course. And he's very explicit that the two are intertwined dialectically all along. There's no apophatic theology without cataphatic theology.
If you want to, this is Dionysius the Areopagite. He's a really interesting figure and I think of him in the context of when Paul was talking to the Greeks on Mars Hill. Wasn't Dionysius sort of that ilk, of the intellectual class of...
Well, in the Acts of the Apostles, he was present. He was converted by Paul's speech at that moment. But of course, that was in the 1st century, right? In the 60s. So and it was thought, and actually even Dante does consider that person who was converted by St. Paul to be Dionysius the Areopagite, but it's found out later that the text was really 5th century, early 5th century, because it's quoting from Proclus, who was a later 5th century author. Yeah.
Shoot.
Yeah.
I like the myth better than
Yeah. So it's strange how even, the realities can even enrich the myths. The myths don't have to die. Look what Dante does with the myths.
One of my favorite sayings from Marcus Borg, who is one of my spiritual fathers. I mean, he's just a real mentor. He's gone now, but he was fond of saying, everything in the Bible is true, and some of it actually happened.
Exactly.
With that, Dr. William Franke.
No, that's good. Thank you so much. That's absolutely right, I think. And that goes for Dante as well. It's all really rooted in historical events. But what is history? History is really a myth. It's a discourse that's woven around certain cores of what happened, but you can never grasp what happened per se without some kind of an interpretation, because there's always a perspective. Somebody experiences what happened from their own point of view, so that even the what happened is already apophatic in a certain sense. That is, it exceeds words. It cannot be grasped per se, tel in words. The words always introduce some kind of a perspective, and not just the absolute, the thing itself. But God is the absolute, and that's what Dante is approaching here in Paradiso, the experience of the absolute. And how can you experience that in itself as absolute? You always experience it from your own point of view. So this is really the problematic of the Paradiso, is how to express, how to convey Dante's experience of God. Remember, we started in the Inferno, and even the Inferno is an experience of God, right? We even saw with the inscription over the gate of hell that it's Trinitarian, right? Justitia mossi mio alto fattore. It's, justice. I was la divina potestate. Fecimi la divina potestate, la somma sapienza e il primo amore. It's Trinitarian. Already the divine power, wisdom, and love are inscribed into the Inferno. The Inferno, too, is a negative experience of God, of what happens when God is denied. But in Paradiso, there's a more direct approach. Dante is approaching the vision of God. Il visio Dei. That really is the objective. And that means that the whole discourse of Paradiso is an apophatic discourse, a discourse on what cannot be said. Dante's experience here, his final approach to the divine absolute, cannot be conveyed in words, though he's going to use words. That doesn't mean that you give up words. You use words against themselves. You have to subvert language. Self-subverting language is really the nature of the whole of the Paradiso. And it is scanned from beginning to end by the ineffability topos. The ineffable. This is really where Dante starts. The glory of the one who moves all things. So, it's interesting that he's displaced his focus slightly, not from God only, but the glory. See, that's what you can experience, is the glory of the one who moves all things. And that, of course, that's more Aristotelian language, the unmoved mover. That's not from the Bible. But Dante uses Greek Aristotelian theology, and he synthesizes it together with the biblical revelation, permeates the universe, and glows in one part more and another less. This more and less, is a constant theme of Paradiso. The degrees of beatitude, as the degrees of condemnation and evil, are finely discriminated all through this realm. And there is sort of the mystery of how all of the various individual souls, all the various kinds and degrees of beatitude, how can they all be one? Because everything in God is one, without shadow or without difference or shadow of turning. That is from scriptures, from the letters of James. And Dante echoes that, I think not in the Commedia, but in his prose writings. But the idea, this is standard Christian theology, God is absolutely without difference. Has to be absolute unity and oneness. Dante's begun from this concept of the one, and yet more and less. Everything in Paradiso is more and less. Dante gives us the image of the great sea of being, lo gran mar dell'essere. And you see, in a sea, the imagery of Paradiso, and it's full of imagery, right? The imagery is there. It's just that the absolute truth is only suggested by the imagery and is beyond what can actually be grasped in the image. This visio Dei, the vision of God, is an imageless vision, at least analyzed theologically. And I mentioned this great sea of being, which is one of Dante's definitions of God, in order to suggest that the medium here, if we think of water, it's a whole, right? A whole body, the whole of the ocean. It's one body, but infinitely differentiated degrees of depth. And the same goes for light. It's really light imagery and water imagery that go all the way through the Paradiso. Because light, too, it's one from one source, and yet this, the infinite degrees of differentiation. So this più e meno within oneness is the kind of metaphysical structure that Dante sets up from the very beginning of the poem. And the problem of how to keep this diversity, this multiplicity together in oneness. This is classical philosophical problem from the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, the one and the many. That's still Plato's problem. Why does he invent the theory of the ideas? There's one idea of justice, and then it's instantiated in all sorts of different ways in the world, or even just in any banal chair, right? The pure idea of the chair is absolutely one. So it is a classical philosophical problem, but Dante also sees this as the problem of community, of bringing all together into the oneness where all share in the common being of God. That's paradise, really. That kind of ideal community built on multiplicity and diversity. So Dante claims here, I was in the heaven that receives more of his light. And it's actually più della sua luce. I think it's the most of his light. And this is the Empyrean. There are 10 heavens in the Paradiso. The last that Dante is going to go to is the Empyrean, which is different from the first 9 because it is not a physical heaven. The first 9 heavens are physical. They're the 7 planets. Then there are the fixed stars that we see in the firmament. And then there's an invisible sphere, but it's still physical. He calls it the crystalline sphere, il primo mobile, the first moved. Those are 9 physical heavens. After that, then Dante goes into the true Paradiso, the eternity beyond time and space. And that's what he says. He was there, okay? Even though it's sort of paradoxical, you have to take it back apophatically. How could you be there? It's not a place. It's a state, and it's really nothing that can be said or stated. I was within that heaven that receives more of his light. And here this would be an incorporeal light. This would be pure divine light, not a physical light that can be seen. And I saw things that he who from that height descends forgets or cannot speak. The first instance of the ineffability topos is going to occur over and over again. Many scholars become impatient. They say, this is monotonous. I think we have to understand, why it has to be this way, and it's not monotonous. Every time the experience of God is absolutely new over again, even though once again you can't say it, but it is absolute presence which is always new. So, and when Dante, says that it's not really forgets, even though you could interpret it that way. Ne sa ne può, does not know nor can say, the one who descends. He's alluding here already to St. Paul, who was rapt to the third heaven and heard such things whereof it is not lawful that a man should utter. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And Dante's remember he modeled himself on Paul already in the Inferno, negatively. I am not Paul, I am not Aeneas. And here it is this experience of the Visio Dei, Paul's vision of God, that Dante is alluding to. And one of the things that Paul says is, it starts out, I knew a man, very curiously speaking of himself in the third person, I knew a man in Christ who was rapt to the third heaven. Whether in his body or out of the body, I know not. Paul leaves that open and ambiguous. And Dante does the same, really, following Paul here. Nevertheless, as much as I, within my mind, could treasure the Holy Kingdom, shall now become the matter of my song. What Dante is presenting us in the Paradiso is not exactly the Paradiso itself, which is impossible, but his impression. It made a deep subjective impression on him. That's what he can recount, is how he was affected, how he was transformed by this experience, rather than the object itself. And really, this experience is objectless. If there's an object, there's always a subject, and that makes two, division. The experience that Dante is trying to convey is an objectless, imageless vision. I like to think of, to give a more modern parallel, there's a poem by Arthur Rimbaud, symbolist, French poet, 19th century, called Eternity, L'éternité. That's the title. Je l'ai retrouvé. I found it again. It's very interesting that there is this structure of repeating. We talked about that a good bit in the Inferno. It's the self-reflexivity of thought and language which opens this realm of experience that Dante calls Paradiso. But I just said it's a very short poem, 4 lines. Yeah, he says, elle est retrouvée. Quoi? L'éternité. It's dialogue. It has been found again. What? L'éternité. Already that, breaking into dialogue, you cannot approach the absolute except by some kind of an artificial division and breaking up. And this is what language does. It articulates, right? Okay, so, elle est retrouvée, quoi? L'éternité, c'est la mer allée avec le soleil. It is the sea gone with the sun. So we picture the speaker here at dusk, looking out on the sea, seeing the sea. But eternity is when you don't see the sea. The sea is gone with the sun. There's no more light. So there's really no more sea. That's eternity. It's the erasure of difference. Prior to this moment, there was the difference between the sea and the horizon, enough light to discern difference. But that erasure of total difference and moving into the night of nothingness is the mystic moment, I think, that Rimbaud is calling eternity. And I believe that this is valid all the way from Dante to Rimbaud and to our modern times, that this mystic experience is an apophatic experience of erasing difference in order to be one with all. All right? That you cannot define eternity or paradise, but you can remove the obstacles to it. You can remove the differences that separate you from the absolute and the all. Dante then evokes myths, right? He's still using myth, Apollo, and that's not a Christian myth, right? Still Greek myths. O good Apollo, for this final task, make me the vessel of your excellence. That's an invocation. Remember, usually the poet invokes the muses. We saw that in the Inferno. Dante has that again in Purgatorio. Le Nove Muse. Now he evokes Apollo. Apollo is the god of science, among other things. And the point Dante's making here is that this poem is not only inspired by the muses and beautiful poetic imagery. Now it's truth, science, which is at stake. And he says, until this point, one of Parnassus's peaks, one belongs to the muses, the other belongs to Apollo. One of them was enough, but now I face the test, the agon that is left. I need both crests, science and beauty together. And he is going to say as much, sort of like Keats, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. You have that same doctrine here in Dante. And he refers now to some further myths. That actually, Paradiso is full of Ovidian myths out of the Metamorphosis, because Dante is being metamorphosed from heaven to heaven. He is transformed, translated really, into a previously unknown higher state. And he compares himself here to Marsyas, who is a satyr who was drawn by Apollo out of his limb's sheath. I would like to note, you can see in the Italian, the word is vagina, right? It's a kind of a rebirth here. He's out of his sheath means out of his skin. Apollo flayed Marsyas, who challenged him. Marsyas plays his flute, thought he could be as artistic presumption and arrogance against the gods. Dante's constantly on his guard about this because he's making claims as well to surpass everything human, to actually be able to convey something of divinity. There's a real risk here of hubris, right? And he gives us all these examples. There are plenty more. You've maybe even seen. There have been plenty in Purgatorio on the ledge of pride, Arachne, and other exemplars of pride, and specifically artistic pride, leading one into the arrogance of no longer respecting the gods and their superiority. Dante constantly tries to inoculate himself against that by calling to consciousness that it is a very serious risk. Now, Dante then, he identifies himself as the artist who is sacrificed. And there is a self-sacrificial aspect to Dante's whole life and artistic project. He's like Marsyas, skinned alive, but taken out of the vagina, right, of the body in order to become spirit and inherit the vision of God. O godly force, if you so lend yourself to me, that I might show the shadow of the blessed realm inscribed within my mind. See, this is the point I wanted to make a few moments ago, that what Dante is really offering us here is only sort of the after image that rests with him of this ineffable experience. He can describe his own subjective correlative, is a term I like to use. Not God as an object, but something within him that correlates because of having had this experience. All right. This is just the prologue, but there's another part of it. Let's see. Yeah. What Dante's describing, he does term it transhumanization. Transhumanar, line 70 there. The translation doesn't really give you the verbal compactness and force. Dante's inventing this word. Paradiso, it's full of neologisms. It's absolutely unprecedented. He invents the Italian language, and he invents really his own idiosyncratic language. This is what poetry does, right? It makes language over again new. This is why Dante's poetry, in the Paradiso, everywhere, but especially in the Paradiso, is the template, really, for all of poetic creation, I think, subsequently. So, trasumanar, significar per verba, non si può. You cannot signify verbally what it is to be transhumanized. And now he evokes another Ovidian myth, Glaucus, who ate grass. He saw that fish he's a fisherman, and the fish that he placed on the grass would reanimate and then jump back into the sea. And he said, well, what is with this grass? He tried eating some of the grass, and it divinized him. So again, another Ovidian myth for divinization. Dante is evoking to identify himself. How interesting that Dante can use pagan myth in this way to suggest his ultimate experience of the Christian truth. He realizes that language is per se myth, that it can give us images, but the images are not to be identified per se with the truth. The images point us towards something beyond. This is the apophatic period. And when he says, whether I was only the part of me that you created last, you governing the heavens. He's addressing himself, obviously, to God, the Creator. It was your light that raised me. This is the moment, already in the first canto, when he is raised to the first heaven. But when he says, the part of me that you created last, it's novellamente. This would be the soul, right? Human beings are a composite of body and soul. And God creates the body. It has even a vegetative soul, an animal soul. The fetus develops, up to about 6 months. But then God directly infuses the rational, intellectual soul. That does not come from matter and the world. That is a direct infusion from above. Dante's saying, so, whether I was translated into heaven, soul and body, or only the part of me that you created last, that is my intellectual soul, I don't know. Again, he's repeating Paul. Whether in the body or out of the body, I know not, God knoweth. And the rest then of the first canto is a speech by Beatrice, who's his guide, right, in the earthly paradise, at the top of the mountain of Purgatorio, the Eden. Beatrice replaced Virgil as Dante's guide, and she guides him all the way through the Paradiso, not quite all the way, because at the very end then Saint Bernard, the mystic, comes on the scene, and Beatrice takes her place in the celestial rose, and Dante has, the last segment, he's accompanied by Bernard. But this first speech now in Paradiso of Beatrice, her first doctrinal speech, and Paradiso is full of doctrines, right, under the aegis here of Apollo, presents to us the order of the universe. All things among themselves possess an order, and this order is the form that makes the universe like God, right? God is order. The order that we see in things is a semblance, a resemblance. It orients us, it enables us to understand something of God. And here's this phrase, the mighty sea of being, lo gran mar dell'essere. Everything is oriented through the sea of being towards one goal, which is God. This is what Dante calls providence, right? The providence that has arrayed all this forever quiets with its light that heaven in which the swiftest of the spheres revolves. The swiftest of the spheres would be this primo mobile, the crystalline sphere, the ninth one that I mentioned, because the 10th heaven does not move. It doesn't have any speed whatsoever. Now, I forget why I put this in Dante in the sense of transgression. I think I wanted to just mention that to read the Paradiso, rather than using the paradigm of interpretation, the hermeneutic paradigm, which I brought up quite a bit when we were talking about the Inferno, and that's based on German philosophers. That is, to think this through in contemporary philosophical terms. It's the theory of interpretation, which is the key. Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer are the philosophers, and Paul Ricoeur, that set that paradigm for how to interpret. But Paradiso goes beyond interpretation to the uninterpretable, to what cannot be formulated. And I use a different theoretical paradigm for Paradiso. No longer hermeneutics, but rather deconstruction. The French deconstructionist philosophers, Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida, Georges Bataille, these are thinkers of rupture. And these are post-modern thinkers of what cannot be properly understood. They're very sort of anti-rationalist. And that really does jive with Dante going to the limits of reason. Dante is a rationalist, but a classical medieval rationalist that sees also the limits of reason, because reason is not God, right? God is really beyond anything reasonable for us. And we're going to see how it's really when our reason is completely befuddled that becomes the manifestation of God in some of the heavens that we'll go through now progressively. There's a kind of transgressiveness that is the spirit of these French philosophers, which give us this paradigm we call, it's in the universe, it's called, deconstruction is sort of the buzzword. But what it's based on is negative theology. This word apophasis, in Greek is the word for negation. And apophatic theology is negative theology. So I think we get a contemporary version of negative theology secularized in this French deconstructive movement, which gives me a theoretical framework for interpreting Dante. Now, cantos 2 through 5, Dante's in the first heaven, the heaven of the moon. And this is the very beginning. And I do think this is relevant to us as readers approaching Dante's Paradiso. In this part of the poem, talk to the Italians on the street. Oh, Paradiso. They had to read it in school. It's beyond them. The Inferno, that was pretty interesting. Purgatory. I do not share, this opinion. Paradiso, it's totally intelligible but it takes us to the limits of intelligibility. It does require a lot of theology. That we have to admit. It's full of these doctrinal discourses. But the thing is that the doctrinal discourses themselves become lyrical. Dante makes poetry out of wisdom, out of the knowledge. It's not just concepts, abstract formulas. It becomes music. Everything in the Paradiso and the highest, sublimest kinds of doctrine become music. This is the aspiration, I believe, of modern poetry as well, to become music. It becomes explicit in this French symbolist movement. Mallarmé is the culmination, I think, who writes poetry. And there you say, boy, this doesn't make sense. But it's sort of, it seems like it's going to make sense, and then it really, doesn't. But it makes an incredible music. Now, there is always a conceptual meaning in Dante, a clear conceptual meaning. But that is not the final meaning or object. I think that is an allusion to some sort of a higher experience. Now, Dante gives us a warning as we approach the Paradiso as readers. Oh, you who are within your little bark, right? We're setting out on this great sea of being, eager to listen, following behind my ship that singing crosses the deep seas, right? This is the conventional topos of the poet, singing, and the ship of poetry. Turn back to see your shores again. Do not attempt to sail the seas I sail. You may, by losing sight of me, be left astray, right? You're going to be lost. The waves I take were never sailed before me. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, breathes. Apollo pilots me, and the 9 muses show to me the bears, right? Ursula Maggiore, it's really sort of the Big Dipper that Dante is looking at. You other few. So the poem he's designating here for the select few who turn your minds in time unto the bread of angels. That's divine wisdom, pan degli angeli. That's what he's going to serve up if we're prepared for it, which provides men here with life, but hungering for more. You come along, keep your course in my wake. So he does actually, I guess Dante's anticipated the reaction that I was just speaking about, that it's maybe not for everyone, even though, everyone is invited to try to prepare themselves for this great journey. Something I've just mentioned, the self-reflexivity of water, of light, and of language itself. To read Paradiso, we have to become more and more aware of how language is all self-reflexive in nature. And lyrical language, right, when language becomes song, it intensifies to the highest degree this self-reflexive element. Rhyme, rhythm, assonance, alliteration are all forms of self-reflexivity, right, where one element is mirrored and repeats itself. This is what makes language lyrical. And Dante is really intensifying the self-reflexivity of language to the highest degree. And of course, all of this mirrors the self-reflexivity of the Trinity, the nature of God itself. God is being in medieval scholastic theology, but that doesn't mean just substance, right, which is the Aristotelian Greek understanding of being. Being, in the ultimate instance, is self-reflexive being. The Father seeing himself in the perfect image of the Father is the Son. And then the love between them, right, reflected into the love between them, that's the Holy Spirit. The very nature of being is to be self-reflexive. And one place where Dante underlines this is at the beginning of Canto 10, gazing upon his Son, with that love which one and the other breathe eternally, the power first and inexpressible. Right, so you see the elements of the Trinity there. And he describes then how the whole universe comes from this self-reflexive dynamic of the Holy Trinity. And he invites the reader to lift their eyes to the high wheels. Those are the heavens wheeling around the earth. This is one of the addresses to the reader. I remember emphasizing the address to the reader in Canto 9 of the Inferno. O voi che avete gli intelletti sani, you who have sound intellects. Look at the meaning behind the narrative. There are 21 of these addresses to the reader that punctuate the whole poem. It's those addresses to the reader, I think, that make the poem an event of truth in the mind and reception and interpretation of the reader. it's not just, what happens objectively in the narrative. It's what you're able to make of that as the reader when you appropriate it and begin to interpret it. At this stage, though, what I wanted really just to make sure we have in mind the self-reflexivity of especially lyrical language. Dante, he, in Canto 3, this is in the Heaven of the Moon, the first time he encounters actual souls, he gives us language that I think makes this point. I don't know how to get rid of this. This is not my computer. I'm afraid I'm going to throw us off if I try anything. Maybe I can get rid of it this way. Okay. This is really now the first description. And I want to look at and listen to the self-reflexive language, even just the reflexive verbs. I'm going to read this, I think, in Italian. I want you to hear the assonances, the alliterations, which create this saturated self-reflexivity of language. So I'm reading, quali per vetri trasparenti e tersi, over per acque nitide e tranquille, non si profonde che I fondi si impersi. Just as returning through transparent, clean glass, or through waters calm and crystalline, he's seeing reflected images here. He thinks they're reflected images. So shallow that they scarcely can reflect. The mirrored image of our faces meets our pupils with no greater force than that a pearl has when displayed on a white forehead. See, here again we have the idea of the erasure of difference. A pearl on a white forehead. Well, is there any kind of contrast? It's minimal, it's maybe disappearing. How can you perceive that, white on white? That is really the problematic here of Paradiso. Dante gives us a lot of differences, but in order to erase them and take us into this experience, this mystical experience of indifferentiation of the absolute. Now, what he sees then are images, faint images, sort of disappearing images, so faint, the many faces I saw keen to speak. Thus my mistake was contrary to that which led the man to love the fountain. That's very interesting. Do we know, we have to think of who is that man that loved the fountain. That's another Ovidian myth. Narcissus. He fell in love with his own image.
Narcissus?
His own image, that's right, reflected. Now, Dante evokes this myth of Narcissus. We've had this before. In fact, there's a program of redeeming Narcissus. In the 30th canto of each cantico, in Inferno 30, lo specchio di Narciso, Master Adam refers to the mirror of Narcissus. There's a moment in the 30th canto of Purgatorio where Dante sees his own image mirrored. This is when he's confessing, he's repenting, he has to face his own image and, brings contrition over him. But it's a narcissistic moment, a kind of anti-narcissistic moment. Now here he says specifically that he makes the mistake contrary to the mistake that was made by the man that fell in love with his own image in the fountain. That is, Dante thinks that what he sees are reflected images, but actually they're true substances, as Beatrice says later. Vere substanze son ciò che tu vedi. All right, now Dante's making the mistake contrary. He takes what is true substance for a mere image. It looks to him like an image, but Beatrice says, no, these are the true substance. And I find it very interesting that in Ovid, Narcissus is a youth. Dante makes him a man. He sort of ennobles Narcissus, making him a man. And it's Dante who becomes the one with the pueril cotto. You reason like a child. And actually, Beatrice is more sarcastic than that. Pueril cotto. This is, you're crazy, childish. And this transfer of the childishness from Narcissus to Dante. Dante is in the position of Narcissus as he goes through Paradiso, and his understanding has to be constantly corrected. Narcissus in Paradiso is going to be redeemed. Narcissus is the archetype of self-reflexivity, and it's condemned, of course, in medieval myth and even in contemporary psychology in many ways, right? Narcissism. It can be very, very bad. But there's something else, there's some kind of a narcissism that is good. God himself is the first narcissist, as we saw with that Trinitarian self-reflexivity. We have to differentiate between the narcissism that leads to hell and the narcissism that is part of the process of becoming blessed and actually finding the divine image in oneself. There's a program here of redeeming self-reflexivity, self-reflexiveness under the emblematic sign of Narcissus. Now, in the heaven of the moon, here's Narcissus, Caravaggio's Narcissus. You can see he is very, very young. The heaven of the moon is where we meet the nuns who have been inconstant to their vows, right? The moon is the planet of inconstancy, the changeableness. But in Canto 4, I'm going to come to that in 5, in Canto 5. Here in Canto 4, there's another important point that Dante makes about the whole design of Paradiso. And it has to do with the idea that these are true substances. Dante saw the actual souls, the reality of those souls. It is rather complicated. And Dante tries to explain in this passage, and he starts saying that neither seraph, the seraph closest to God, nor Moses, nor Samuel, nobody can really see all the way to the bottom of God's mind. And the places in heaven, how they're determined, we don't really know that. Dante affirms in this passage that all the souls find themselves in the Empyrean, that is, outside space and time, in the 10th, the final heaven. They're going to show themselves to Dante in each of the 9 heavens according to their degree of beatitude. Right? Per mostrar. They showed themselves to you here, not because this is their sphere, but as a sign for you that in the Empyrean their place is lowest. It's just the degree of spiritual beatitude that corresponds analogically with the moon, the lowest of the heavenly spheres. It seems to be contradictory with the idea that Dante saw the true substance. Now it's just sort of a show. Ultimately, you cannot see God. The souls themselves they're in God. And Dante wants to affirm, however, that he is really seeing the souls. He does have a true vision, but it's not to be identified with what he's able to describe. So I don't think it's really the visual form. It's a metaphysical vision. He sees the true substance of these souls, but he describes with picture language, as does the Bible, right? Gabriel and Michael and the angel who healed the eyes of Tobit are portrayed by Holy Church with human visages. This is called accommodation. The scripture itself accommodates to our understanding, which is based on sensory experience. Dante does take this doctrine over from Aristotle. What is without body, what is incorporeal, purely spiritual, we can only understand in corporeal terms. Dante is constantly driven throughout the Paradiso by doubt and questioning. We cannot satisfy our mind unless it is enlightened by the truth beyond whose boundary no truth lies. Doubting blossoms, right? It's a fertile process. These doubts that propel Dante further and further and higher through the Paradiso. It is very much a journey of the mind to God, right? To cite the title of St. Bonaventure, Itinerarium Mentis in Deum. And it is propelled by the questioning, the perplexity of the intellect, and always searching for further truth. Now, as I mentioned, the issue in this canto, il voto, the vow and free will. Let's see. Yeah, well, this is the next heaven, and even a bit further. Dante meets Picarda Donati, who was the sister of a friend of his. He married into the Donati family. Gemma Donati was his wife, and she's a nun. She was then forced out of the convent by her brother Corso, and that counts as inconstancy, right? She broke her vow, really not of her own will. And she says the same holds for the Empress Costanza, who's next to her, the name Costanza, right? We're in this sphere of inconstancy. Dante, he wants to develop a theology of the vow. What is a vow? It's a sacrifice of one's free will, is how he understands it. And that's the highest gift that we have. Nothing can really substitute for a vow. You can substitute the matter, but not the form. The form is this absolute giving up of one's own free will to God. Now, he does develop this profound theology of the vow, and in the next heaven, the heaven of Mercury, he's going to develop another kind of a theological discourse connected with this one, I think, about free will. The main speaker throughout Canto 6 is the Emperor Justinian, right, in Byzantium. From the first to the last word, Canto 6 is spoken entirely by Justinian. At the end of Canto 5, you have this light that overwhelms the form. Dante, he said, I can't really see because the light is too bright. This is the case with the souls in Paradiso. The effulgence of light effaces the image. But we learned that this is Justinian. He tells the story of the Roman Empire, really, from beginning to end, as the story of the imperial eagle il sacrosanto segno, right, the sacrosanct sign, travels from Troy with Aeneas, founding the empire, the succession of kings and emperors. He tells the whole story, including the wars of conquest and the bloodbath, even though Dante does sacralize this history. And he comes to a certain point in this history where Jerusalem is destroyed by Titus, the Roman emperor. And it says, far vendetta corse della vendetta. This is a vengeance for original sin, as Dante interprets it. That is, Adam is punished by the crucifixion of Christ. Christ is human. He assumes human sin, and there's a kind of atonement for Adam's sin in the death of Christ on the cross. And yet, when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD by Emperor Titus, that counts as a just vengeance. And for the question for Dante, well, wait a minute. If the vengeance was just, then how can punishing that vengeance also be just? This is the question that exercises Dante. How can just vengeance be justly avenged? This incites then Beatrice's doctrinal discourse on the atonement in Canto 7. We have these marvelous lyrical doctrinal discourses. And to give you the gist of it, God becomes man in order that man can participate in his own redemption, that humanity can participate in its own redemption, rather than just have it, come down from above and be imposed. This is the, cur Deus homo. Why does God become man? That's, St. Anselm wrote that treatise. And for Dante, it's because for humanity to be redeemed in Christ, okay, it's the act of God. Humanity was not capable of redeeming itself. It needed God's help. But humanity has to be part of the process, has to participate in order to be truly redeemed, rather than just be handled like a puppet, right? So there really is a deep thinking here of the interaction between the human and the divine in the process of redemption. Now, the next heaven is the heaven of Venus. All right, this is the third now, the heaven of love. And I want to point something out here about Dante's language. God can see all, I said, and blessed spirit, I think he's speaking here to Folco of Marsiglia, who became the bishop of Marseille. Your vision is contained in him so that no wish can ever hide itself from you. You have to look at the Italian, right? Dio vede, e tuo veder sin luia. Dante's saying to this blessed soul, your vision, sin luia. It's a reflexive verb. That's the S apostrophe that makes it reflexive. And the verb is constructed. This is another neologism. It's constructed by the preposition in. Lui is a pronoun, him, and it's verbalized, right? This, pronoun with preposition, verbalized and made reflexive. That's what Dante's done with the basic building blocks of the Italian language. He's created a word that literally in English would mean you in sin luia. You in purify yourself. Let me do this with, if you look down a little bit lower, s'io m'intuassi come tutti in me. He uses the same model here. If I were to inuify myself, m'intuassi, as you in meify yourself. That is literally what those words are saying, right? This gives you a sense of the originality of the language of Paradiso. And in this passage, where we describe Folgo of Marseille, Dante doesn't name Marseille. He describes it by elaborate periphrases. The Mediterranean from one side and the other. It's between. He's saying, between, and you can see that the tra is placed at the beginning. Between the discordant shores. This technique of not naming with just a simple identification, but giving you coordinates. That's the play of difference that constitutes language. And Dante's constantly doing that in order to show us how language works self-reflexively. And there are a lot of proper names in the Paradiso. There's a poetics of the proper name. Because the proper name, it is a rigid designator, philosophically. Actually, the proper name does not have a meaning as such, like Robert. It designates an individual without saying anything about that individual, without attributing a connotation or a meaning. And Dante uses these proper names. I think the effect of the intensity of the proper names is to evoke the place that cannot be described, like the proper name does not describe. Everything in Paradiso is referring to this no place. That's literally what utopia means. And the Paradiso is a utopia, a no place. And I think the poetics of proper naming lead us to this dissolution and abandon of meaning in order to open to the totality of the meaningless, which is pregnant with all possible meaning. Now, another point that I don't want to miss here, in the third heaven, the heaven of Venus, Dante says, this heaven, where the shadow cast by earth comes to a point, had Rahab as the first soul to be taken up when Christ triumphed, right? Rahab, the prostitute in Jericho, she too is identified then with love, maybe to an excess. All of the characters, from the inconstancy in the moon to the souls that do good, but motivated by honor, by the desire for honor in Mercury, to now souls who are flawed in some ways, tainted by passion and excess of love. Nevertheless, they're blessed. It didn't prevent them from being blessed, but it is a slight diminishment of their degree of beatitude. The conical shadow cast by the earth into the heavens reaches this point, the third heaven, all right? Because there is a certain emphasis on the imperfection of the souls in these first three heavens. Then we've got two more series of three heavens to make up the 9 physical heavens. But Dante does make this point that they're in some way still under the earth's shadow, blessed as they are. And there's no regret. He hashes this out with Picarda in the moon. Oh no, in sua volontade e nostra pace, in his will is our peace. We're totally fulfilled, even though we're imperfect. That is, we reach the perfection that is possible for us. All right? That applies, I think, to these first 3 of the heavens. And when we move to,
At some point, the next 5 or 10.
Okay, let's take 5 or 10 to try and get through another heaven or 2. We move to the heaven of the sun, actually. And this is where Dante meets the sapient spirits. Sorry, it's maybe not the version that I thought it was that they've put up here. This is the next heaven of Mars. Through, 10 through 14, Dante's in the sun. St. Thomas Aquinas speaks to him throughout Canto 10 and introduces a garland of 12 spirits, right? With Alberto Magnus, his own teacher at Cologne, right next to him. He goes all the way around, some of the great minds of the church fathers and the scholastic theologians. He gets to the end, and it's Sige de Brabant, who was his opponent in the University of Paris. He, wrote polemical treatises against him. Here, they're dancing together, right, in heaven, having been enemies, really, on earth. We get this garland. There are two coronae, they're crowns or garlands of sapient spirits. And St. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican, but in Canto 11, he celebrates St. Francis, right, the founder of the Franciscan order. In it's really one of the most moving of the cantos, full of the history, St. Francis, all of his acts and their symbolic significance. Donna Povertà, he marries Lady Poverty, right, who joins him on the cross. He was abandoned by everyone, but Lady Poverty, remained with him on the cross. And after this celebration of the Franciscans by the Dominican friar St. Thomas, at the end then of the Canto 11, Thomas recalls the decadence of his own order, the Dominicans, and lambasts them for having lost the original inspiration. So there's a kind of a crossover structure. And the next canto, 12, takes up the eulogy of St. Dominic by the Franciscan St. Bonaventure, right? Thomas's contemporary, both died about 1274. And they were colleagues at the University of Paris. But again, making these orders work together in harmony. They have distinguished vocations. The Franciscans are seraphic in love, right? The Dominicans are cherubic in intellect, the light of intellect. It's the preaching order. But everything harmonizes and is complementary here in Paradiso. And Bonaventure then, after going through the praises of St. Dominic, the divine athlete, there are a lot of vigorous, even sort of violent images as well. He against heresy. Dominic is, the great hound against heresy. All of this comes into the Paradiso as well. It's in the Bible. After this praise for the other order, then he goes into his own order, the Franciscans, and declares their abject decadence in the present, and how they've declined. And maybe there are still some true to the original model, but he says it's neither the radical Franciscans nor the conventual Franciscans. Aqua Sparta, he identifies them with various figures, Matteo da Aqua Sparta. So there's a strong self-critical discourse that's built into this heaven of the sun, the sapient spirits, before we move to Mars and the warrior spirits. Okay, we can have a break there then.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.